Good morning. Pastor Edmund introduced me as the pastor at large at our church, and I'm trying to figure out what that means. I'm glad that they didn't name it the large pastor, because I would take that personal on many levels. I've been an English pastor in a Chinese church for 20 years in Toronto, so I've kind of been around a little bit. I've actually, as I was reflecting, I've never actually preached here in this building. I think the last time I was here for an English service, I think I played in the band. I think Justice Ko was here or something, and I played in the band or something. And that was the only time I got invited to play guitar. Anyways, that's a whole other topic. It's a pleasure to be here. It's great to kick off your missions month. I never saw myself as a missionary growing up, or when I felt called into ministry. I knew that God is calling me to the local church, to pastor, to shepherd, to lead, to care, to love for people, to walk with them. And that was something that I felt very dear to my heart. And even now, I've taken over as the director of the Tyndale Intercultural Ministry Center. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I actually have a booth. I've become one of those booth people. I don't know if you have like this stereotype of booth people, but I've become a booth person, and I have a booth in the gym, so I'm really happy to talk to any of you afterwards about the things that we're doing: research, diploma courses, training, equipping, networking, all that stuff that we're doing. I'll talk a little bit about it during my message as well. Your theme for this missions month is come and see, go and be, and I believe this is a denomination-wide theme, right? So not just your church, not just other congregations, but many I was going to say several hundred. I don't think you have several hundred churches in the dome. Many churches are talking about this same theme: come and see, go and be. And I think it's a great theme in terms of what it means as people of God to be called into ministry, to be called into to serve and to love and to go and be the church of Christ wherever you are. I've chosen today to speak on Jonah, one of the minor prophets. And I don't know how much you've studied the minor prophets before. If I can get the first slide. Jonah comes from a part of the Bible called the minor prophets. Now, these are the minor prophets. I don't know if you've ever studied Jonah before. Now, I'll be honest, I chose Jonah because Jonah is one of those stories that people kind of know, but they're not really sure. And they know a little bit about it, and I think Jonah is one of those stories that really sticks out, right? Like, I don't think I have to tell you too much for you to identify which one of those minor prophets is Jonah, yeah? He kind of sticks out a little bit because he's the big fish. Now, I know some of you guys are looking at the naked guy beside him, but try to draw your attention away from the naked guy. If you find yourself locked on the naked guy, Pastor Edmund has a prayer room. You can go into some confession time over there later on, but you're more than welcome to pray about some of those baggage issues that you have. But we're going to focus on the fish today. And now, I don't know if you've studied the book of Jonah before. You might have heard the story. Even if you've never been in church or grown up in the church, I'm willing to bet that many people have heard the story of Jonah being swallowed by a big fish. Sometimes I'll go into churches and I'll say, I say Jonah, you say fish. Sometimes they say whale. Somebody says whale sometimes because there's this conception that it was a big whale that swallowed Jonah. Now the Bible doesn't actually say whale, so we don't know if it actually is a whale. But let me do a quick summary of the book of Jonah. Next slide. So, as common as the story is, I'm not sure if everyone always knows the book of Jonah completely. Am I really loud to you, or is that just me? That's just me. Okay, so I feel like I'm like shouting at you, which I sort of am because the room is big and I'm a spatial guy, so I feel like I have to reach the top corners of the people up there. I'm staring at the people at the back because it's like, I want to feel connected. But I can't unless I go up there, right? So anyway, okay, so the book of Jonah. Let me do a quick summary of the entire book so that you know what's going on. There's only 4 chapters. Pastor Edmund told me that I can go as long as I want, that the second service loves it when we go overtime. They really enjoy us going longer into lunch because they don't mind, because they love the English congregation. I promise I will not go that long. Chapter 1. So, chapter 1, God calls Jonah. Jonah is a prophet. He's a person of God. He's a minister in God's temple. And God calls Jonah to go to a place called Nineveh. And Jonah, on the other hand, runs away and he says, heck no, I don't want to go to Nineveh. I'm going to go the other way. So he goes the other way and he jumps onto a ship. And he even tells the sailors on the ship, I'm running away from God, so take me all the way to Tarshish. So he gets on the boat and he goes across to Tarshish. And as they're sailing along, a big storm comes, and a storm so violent that all the sailors on the boat are thinking to themselves, we will surely die. This storm is huge. We just have this little dinghy. You know, I don't know if you guys sail, I don't know if you guys boat, whatever it is. Anyways, they're in a boat, they think they're going to die, and Jonah says to them all, they start worshiping to their gods, they start sacrificing things, they start praying to their gods, saying, our God of whatever God, please help save us, but nothing happens. And so Jonah says to the rest of the sailors, hey, you know what, guys? I'm pretty sure it's me. I'm pretty sure my God is coming after me, so throw me overboard. He actually says to the sailors, throw me overboard. So he gets thrown overboard, and as soon as he goes overboard, the storm calms. The storm calms, and the sailors are all like, ah. And it says in chapter 1, we are not even out of chapter 1 yet, it says in chapter 1 that the sailors worshipped Yahweh. So right there in chapter 1 is this conversion story. These sailors who think they're about to die with Jonah all of a sudden start worshiping God. They start worshiping the God of Jehovah, Abraham, and they start converting to the God of Jonah because they see how mighty and powerful Jonah's God is. And even though they just killed a guy, to them it's like, oh wow, God saved us. Now at the end of chapter 1, that's basically where we leave him. He's in the water, and then he gets swallowed by a fish in chapter 2. Now, interestingly enough, in chapter 2, and I put chapter 2 in italics, leaning to the right or to the left, which way you're looking, because chapter 2 is the only time in the book of Jonah where it's written in the first person. Those of you who are English majors or literary giants, or you just like to read, those of you who are podcasters, you have no idea what italics means. Anyways, italics is when the font is a little different and the words are a little different. And so all of a sudden, chapter 2, we see this chapter being written in the first person. Now that's of particular note because the rest of the book of Jonah is written in the third person. We're not really sure 100%. I mean, nobody physically saw Jonah sit down and write it. So sometimes people will argue, well, did Jonah actually write this story? Because it's all in the third person. Every other prophet is written in the first person. Whereas the entire book of Jonah, except for chapter 2, is written in the third person. But here we find Jonah's own words, his own prayer from inside the fish. Now, we're going to come back to this in a minute. But from inside the fish, that prayer is said and beautifully read. Thank you so much for reading that passage. That's Jonah's prayer from within the fish. And you got to read it over a couple times. We'll come back to it in a minute. Again, the particular words that he uses, the feeling, the emotion that he has, that feeling of distress that he has from within the fish. That's what we hear in chapter 2. At the end of chapter 2, it says that God called the fish to vomit out Jonah. Now, literally, I checked the Hebrew. It says vomit. Vomit translated to vomit is vomit. So yes, the fish vomited out Jonah. Now, I don't know the last time you vomited. Hopefully it wasn't recent. Some of you who are parents, you see your children vomit all the time. Now, if you remember the last time you vomited or the last time you saw your child vomit, at the very end of the vomit, there's that bile, that burn. That's what Jonah is in. He's in the bile. He's got this burning stench, disgusting. I'm trying to gross you out, by the way, in case you didn't figure it out. Because you got to know the feeling, the sense of the narrative that is being told here. That Jonah is covered in bile, in vomit, and he gets spit out onto dry land. Now, that leads us to chapter 3. So chapter 3, finally, covered in bile, Jonah says, okay, fine, God. Fine, God. God calls him again, says, go to the city of Nineveh. And finally, Jonah says, fine, I'll go and follow you. I'll go to the city of Nineveh. He goes to the city of Nineveh. Now remember, he's covered in vomit. He just came out of a fish. He was inside a fish, and he's covered. He's not smelling so good. He's not like Irish Spring fresh and clean, right? He's a little bit disgusting. He goes to this city, and all he says to the people of Nineveh is 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. That's it. 40 more days and the city of Nineveh will be overthrown. And it says that the entire city turned and worshiped God. That's all he did. 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. There was no Alpha course. There was no Kairos course. Those are great stuff, by the way. Go talk to Pastor Randall about that. But there was no bridge analogy. There was no atonement theory. There was no, oh, come and see, let me tell you the gospel message. No. 40 more days and this city is going to be destroyed. And all of a sudden, everybody turns to God. That's pretty incredible. That's pretty awesome. I think that has nothing to do with Jonah, but all to do with God. That's basically all of chapter 3. The entire city turns to God, even the animals, it says, when all he says is 40 more days and this city will be destroyed. Then we find ourselves in chapter 4. So Jonah is kind of upset. He's kind of angry. He's pouting. He said, God, Nineveh, don't you know I didn't want to go, not just because I didn't like to preach. I didn't want to go, not just because I don't like to travel. I didn't want to go, God, because those are the enemies of my people. Don't you know God? Well, of course you know God. But Nineveh is the capital city of this nation that has been killing and oppressing my people for centuries. I don't want to go. And now you save them. Now you go and save them and welcome them into heaven. And so Jonah is upset. He's pouting. He's mad. He sits down. He's like, I don't like you, God, even though he just converted the entire city, right? I mean, that's pretty, I'd be pretty excited if I preached 40 more days and that's it, right? That'd be pretty good. 40 more days, the entire city converts, but he's upset. He's sulking. He's angry. He's sitting. And this weed grows up behind him as he's sitting there baking in the sun. He's burning up. It's a light even brighter than this light. This is a really bright light, by the way. This is really bright. Anyways, he's sitting in the sun and he's baking. He's sweating. And as he's sitting there, he's like, oh, this sucks. I don't like God. I don't like Nineveh. I don't like this sun. And then God grows this weed behind him, this plant, to give him shade. And in the shade, he's like, oh, this feels pretty good. This feels pretty good. But then God says, you like this shade, don't you? So he sends a worm. A worm comes over and eats the weed, and the weed dies, and all of a sudden the weed goes away, and he's like, where did the worm come from? And here we find Jonah still complaining, still whining, still upset at God because of this worm and this plant, and now this sun, and God saving the Ninevites. The end of the book ends with God saying to Jonah, you've been so concerned about this plant. You've been concerned about this worm. You've been concerned about this sun. Shouldn't we have been concerned about the Ninevites? Should we not have concerned about all these thousands of people? 20,000 people, he actually says. 120,000 people who can't tell their right from their left. Shouldn't I be concerned about them too? And that's how the story ends. Come on, right? If anyone's ever told stories before, you know the end of a story always ends with, and they all lived happily ever after, right? You want to end the story, Jonah, with, and Jonah learned his lesson, and so he too confessed and repented of the Lord. He went to Pastor Edmund and went to the prayer room and also prayed to God about looking at naked men, or something. But it doesn't end there. It ends with an unfinished story just saying, and shouldn't I be concerned? An end of story. We have no idea what happens. We don't know what happens with Jonah. We don't know what happens with Nineveh according to the biblical text. It just ends abruptly there. Now, what I love about the book of Jonah isn't just that it's kind of an awkward ending story, but that it is a narrative, a biblical narrative. Next slide. Now, the thing about Old Testament narrative is that rabbis would take passages in the narratives and gospels, even those stories there, they would turn them and they would say, you know what, these stories are rich in meaning, rich in depth, and like a fine gem, every time you turn them, it reflects a different light. Every time you turn them, it tells a different story. Every time it turns them, there's a new contrast to reflect from. So amuse me, if you will. Maybe you've heard the story of Jonah before, but let me turn the story a few times to see what it says. Typically, we've heard comfort versus call. We've heard this idea from Jonah that, it's not comfortable sometimes when God calls you, and so we have this leaning, this desire to be comfortable in our lives, and so we go towards that. And yet sometimes God calls us to something that's not so comfortable. Every Sunday morning when you get up and you come to church, you struggle with this minor question: do I stay in this beautiful warm bed with this comfortable pillow resting against my face, or do I get up, put clothes on, and actually go to Sunday service? On a larger level, maybe for some of you it was a struggle to be called to go to a short-term mission trip, maybe to Laos or to somewhere else in the world. And that's a comfort versus call decision. Some people are like, well, I'm using my vacation. Wow, it would be really comfortable if I went to some Caribbean island on a resort somewhere, and that would be comfortable, but God, you're calling me to some majority world country who I don't even know if I'm sleeping in a tent or where I'm sleeping on the floor. The comfort versus call. And so Jonah is a good message around that. I think about comfort versus call every single time I preach. Because when I felt called to ministry, I remember saying specifically to God, okay, God, I feel like you're calling me to go into ministry, but I hate public speaking. Like, I hate it. I loathe it. I absolutely loathe public speaking. I still remember in grade 1 standing in front of the entire school with my knees shaking, and I think I was turning a bright green color because I was about to puke all over the gym floor because I was so nervous standing in front of my whole school. And so for me, being a minister is this question of comfort versus call all the time. I hate public speaking, and yet I know and I'm compelled by God's call onto my life and what that means. If you need to hear that message this morning, if you need to hear comfort versus call, I need you just to rest on that message and not listen to anything else I say. Because some of you are going through things right now. Maybe it's a small decision, maybe it's a big decision, maybe it's a big lifetime decision where you're struggling with something that's comfortable versus something that you know that God's called you to. And if you need to hear that message this morning, stay there. But let me turn the story one more time. What I said was in chapter 2, from inside the fish, it really stood out because these are Jonah's words. Now, hear them carefully. In my distress, from the deep, you hurled me into the depths. I have been banished. The gulfing waters threaten me. The deep surround me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. I don't know about you, but when you hear those words, this is a man who is in deep, deep, lowest of the low. Possibly depression. I'm not a psychoanalyst, but he's probably going through a real dark time in his life. If you review a little bit, it was him saying to the sailors, throw me overboard. What's that? That's a man who's desiring death. That's a man who understands that he would rather die than move forward. Chapter 2, we find a snapshot of a man in the lowest of his low. I don't know what you're going through in life, but we've all been through dark hours in our lives. And maybe for some of you who are young adults or young students, maybe the first time you failed a test, you felt like it was the end of the world. After you failed the 5th test, it wasn't so bad anymore. Maybe for some of you, you were broken up, you got dumped by your boyfriend or girlfriend, and you felt pretty low. You felt like the darkest of dark. Maybe for some of you, the first time you lost your job, or even the 5th time you lose your job, it doesn't feel any better. Maybe you've failed out of school. Maybe you're struggling with mental illness. Maybe for some of you, you still struggle in your marriage and relationship today. And maybe you can relate to those words that Jonah says in his prayer. And I'm not here to belittle your situation, and I'm not going to stand here and say, oh, it's okay, just pray about it. But what I want to say this morning, if you're in that place from inside the fish, that I pray that you understand that others resonate with you, that you're not alone, that you're not the only person who's gone through a dark hour. You're not the only person who's gone through and struggled with being alive and wanting to kill yourself. That God can be with you, that there is hope, that there is salvation. I don't know in what form that will come, but I pray that you'll resonate with Jonah's words, that you'll find help, you'll talk to others, you'll seek professional advice around that. Let me turn the story one more time. Nineveh. For me, I'm I'm a spatial person. I like space. I see a big room and I see space. I go to the shopping mall and I want to see the map because I like space. I know where things are. I want to know where things are. So when I came to this book of Jonah, I looked up the map. Next slide. And if you find out where Nineveh is, now, you may not see it. Nineveh is over here where B is, on the very far right. All right? Now, from what we understand, Jonah is called over here in A. And so God calls him to go about 500 kilometers to Nineveh. Now, 500 kilometers seems a little far, right? 500 kilometers from Toronto is like Montreal. Anybody go to Montreal before? Anybody go to Pokemon, that Pokemon event in Montreal? Yeah, confession. You guys go to the prayer room too. So 500 kilometers, they went to Nineveh. But Jonah said, no, I don't want to go to Montreal. I'm going to go all the way to Tarshish. Now, Tarshish equivalent would be like, no, God, I don't want to go to Montreal. I would rather go to Japan where the real Pokemon are, right? No. So Jonah, it's like, it would be like, nowadays you don't drive 5 hours, right? 500 kilometers, it'd be like flying, right? So instead of flying to a 5-hour flight to take you to like London, I think. London, Paris, about 5-6 hours, right? Instead of going to London, God calling you to London, it's like you saying to God, heck no, God, I'd rather fly to Australia. How long does the flight to Australia? 30 hours? 30 hours? Yeah, that's pretty long, right? That's long. And you're like, no, what? Why would you go to Australia? Did you know, I was talking to a friend, that a flight to Mauritius, anybody know how far Mauritius is? 33 hours. 33 hours on a plane. It's like you saying to God, God, I know you're calling me to London, but I'd rather go to Mauritius. Because that's what Jonah basically says. I know you're calling me to Nineveh, but I'd rather go to Tarshish. Now that's dramatic. Why would you go all the way here when God's just calling you over there? That made me think about what we do at the Tim Center. Next slide. Much of the work that we do at the Tim Center talks about teaching people and showing people that the world has come to your doorstep. That God has brought people from around the world to our local neighborhoods. We have a website. We have a couple of websites. One of the websites is called You Reach Canada. I think this comes from You Reach Toronto, which is a click from You Reach Canada. And it basically, we try to equip people to realize that, hey, there are the nations at our doorstep, that there are the nations just in our own neighborhoods. And sure, it's great to go overseas, and I think people should go overseas all the time. I think people should follow Pastor Edmund to the ends of the world. But don't forget that right on our doorstep are the nations, especially in a place like Toronto. And so when I think about Nineveh and I think about Jonah, sure, it's great to go to Tarshish. I think Tarshish is a great place, probably. I don't even know where Tarshish is. But what about on our doorstep? It is now October, by the way. And October for a lot of students means midterms are coming or midterms are upon us. Of course, other students are thinking to themselves, go Doug Ford and let's go strike. But that's a whole other conversation. But for most students, especially university students, October is midterm time, and it's stressful. And when I think about students, I don't just think about regular U of T students, York students, Ryerson students, whatever it be. I think of the growing international student community, especially in places like Toronto. In 2000, there were about 100,000 international students in Canada, all of Canada. From 2000 to 2009, it went up a little bit to 150,000, maybe close to 200,000. But from 2010 to 2018, it jumped up to over 500,000 international students in Canada. Over 500,000, there's a step there, over 500,000 international students in Canada. And you know what? When you're a student, studying in a foreign land, studying in a foreign language, that prayer in Jonah chapter 2 is your prayer because you're lost. You're not sure why you're here. You're confused. You're in the darkest of dark, and you don't know what's going on. 60 years ago, an international student came from Hong Kong. 60 years ago, 6-0. And this international student came from Hong Kong. He found himself in Montreal, of all places. He was a little bit shocked to discover that in Montreal and Canada, the snow comes up to here, and in Montreal, in Canada, that they speak French and not English. He was a little bit shocked by that. And after a couple of years of studying there, he thought to himself, I kind of like Canada. I wouldn't mind staying here, and I wonder how I could stay. So he went to his Sunday school teacher, because now he was being ministered to by the local church. He went to the Sunday school director and said, Mrs. Hebb, is there any way that I can stay in Canada after I graduate? And Mrs. Hebb said, well, I'm just the Sunday school director. I don't know, I just help out at church. I don't know how I can help you, but I'll walk with you to the immigration office. And so Mrs. Hebb brought this international student to the immigration office, and the immigration officer looked at them and said, hey, what would you like? And Mrs. Hebb said to the immigration officer, is there any way that this student, after he graduates, could stay in Canada? And the officer looked at Mrs. Hebb, looked at the student, looked at Mrs. Hebb, looked at the student, and said, Mrs. Hebb, this is about 60 years ago. You know that Chinese people are not welcomed in Canada. Officially, look it up, Google it. 60 years ago, immigration officer looks to Mrs. Hebb. He can study here, but when he graduates, he's got to go back. Mrs. Hebb says, come on, you're the immigration officer, you can do something. Can't you pass some papers? You just have to sign it, and he could be, Mrs. Hebb, there's nothing I can do. Mrs. Hebb says, come on, please, is there something you can do for this international student? Officer says, Mrs. Hebb, you know what, I happen to know who your husband is. He was a lead researcher during the war. He's now one of the chancellors at the university. I'll tell you what I can do. If you can find a company to hire him in the next 2 weeks, I'll see what I can do. Mrs. Hebb says, okay, I'll see what I can do in 2 weeks. Brings the international student back to the church and says, somehow she finds a job for him. They come back to the immigration office, and Mrs. Hebb looks at the immigration officer and says, hey, I found him a job. Well, I didn't find him a job. A company wants to hire him because officially she couldn't go find legal thing. A company wants to hire him when he graduates. Is there anything you can do for him? Officer looked at Mrs. Hebb, looked at the student, looked at Mrs. Hebb, looked at the student, and said, welcome to Canada. That international student was my father. When I tell that story, it's not just to tell this wow story, miraculous story, whatever it is, but when I tell that story, it's to remind myself and to remind my children even, I'm not going to point to where they are, but they're here, of how close our lives could have changed in that moment. For some of you who work with young people, maybe you're a youth pastor, maybe you're a teacher, maybe you're a counselor. The ministry and work you do to students, whether they be international students or just students who are not international, the impact on them could last for generations and you don't even know it. For those of you who start opening your eyes and seeing that there's over 500,000 international students who are in their darkest hour, probably hitting midterm time in October. When we think about the opportunity that God has given us to minister to these students, because God has brought them here, how great of an opportunity that is. Now, I'm not an international student worker. My goal at the Tim Center, yes, it is called the Tim Center, by the way, Tim at the Tim Center. We can talk about that at the prayer room as well, is simply to highlight the different diaspora groups that have come to Canada, whether they be refugees, whether they be international students, whether they be seasonal workers, migrant workers who come for a few months trying to start a new life. Do we see those international groups that have come to us? Next slide. Go to the last slide. I don't know what you needed to hear this morning. If you needed comfort versus call, if you needed to be resonated with because you're going through a dark hour, your theme was come and see, go and be. But I think, and I'm willing to bet, many of you have gone on short-term missions before, yeah? Raise your hand if you've gone on a short-term mission before, yeah? Raise your hand if you've been out of the city before, because you've gone on vacation. Raise your hand if you've been on a business trip out of the country, because you've gone somewhere before. All of us probably here have traveled on some level. You've gone and seen the world. My challenge to you this morning is to go and see, because you probably already have, and now come and be the church. Go and see the world, but now come and be the church, because God has brought the world to our doorstep. If you want to talk more with me about different nations, the Laos people, the 5,000 plus Laos people who are in the GTA, and how you could minister to them beyond just short-term mission, love to talk to you. I'll be in the gym. Toronto Christian Community Church. May you be compelled by Jonah. May you be compelled by God that your story is not done, just like the book of Jonah, that it is unfinished because the story is still to come for what this church, what this community, what Christians all across Toronto could write as a story of God's people. Let's pray. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, as we continue to worship, God, may you challenge us, compel us, move us, not just to worship you, not just to grow in our own lives, but to have our eyes opened to see that you have brought the world to our doorstep. May we come and see. May we go and see. But may we ultimately be the church of Christ here in every corner of our lives. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.